The candle in Elira Voss's hand shook so hard that hot wax dripped onto her wrist, and she barely felt it. Outside the chamber door, she could hear her mother arguing, in a fierce whisper with her father, and the words that kept rising above the rest were the ones that made Elira's stomach twist into a knot. Dessa cannot stand. Dessa cannot walk down that hall. If the Alpha King finds out tonight, we lose everything. Elira set the candle down on the table and pressed both hands flat against the wood to stop them from trembling. Through the thin wall she could hear her older sister's ragged breathing, the fever that had crept over Dessa 2 days earlier refusing to break no matter what herbs the healer poured down her throat. Dessa was supposed to be married within the hour. The Alpha King of the Northlands, Heir Draven, was already seated in the great hall with his generals and his advisors, waiting for his bride, and if the wedding did not happen tonight, the fragile peace between their two territories would collapse before sunrise. Her father pushed open the door without knocking. His face was pale, and his eyes found Elira's with a kind of desperate hope that frightened her more than anything he could have said. "You look like her," he said. "In the veil, in the dark, no one will know the difference. You have her height. You have her hair. Elira, I am not asking you to marry him forever. I am asking you to stand where your sister should have stood, just for tonight, just long enough to save this family and this treaty. By morning, we will have found a way to explain it." Elira wanted to laugh, except nothing about this felt like laughter. She wanted to ask her father how anyone could explain replacing a bride at her own wedding, how a lie like that could ever be quietly corrected once it left this room. But she had grown up watching her family bend and fold itself into whatever shape survival demanded, and some old habit deeper than fear made her nod before she had fully decided to. They wrapped her in Dessa's wedding gown, heavy silk the color of moonlight, and pinned a veil so thick over her face that she could barely make out the shapes of the corridor as her mother led her toward the hall. Her mother's hands were cold on her shoulders. "Keep your head down," she whispered. "Do not speak unless you must. Let the ceremony end quickly, and then we will find a way through this." Elira's mind raced with everything that could go wrong. What if Heir Draven recognized instantly that the woman beneath the veil was not the one he had been promised? What if his advisors demanded she lift the veil before the vows were spoken? What if this single desperate act unraveled not just her sister's future, but her own, in ways none of them could yet imagine? But when the doors to the great hall opened and she stepped into the candlelight, none of those fears came true. The hall was enormous, its stone walls lined with banners bearing the crest of the Northlands, a silver wolf circled by a crown of thorns. Rows of nobles and warriors stood on either side of a long carpet, and at the far end, on a raised platform, stood the Alpha King himself. Even from a distance, Elira could feel the weight of him. Heir Draven was tall, in a way that seemed to bend the air around him, his shoulders set with the discipline of a man who had spent his whole life being watched and judged. His dark hair was pushed back from a face that looked carved rather than born, sharp along the jaw, unreadable in the eyes. He did not smile as she approached. He barely seemed to look at her at all. His attention kept drifting toward the doors at the back of the hall, toward his generals, toward a folded piece of parchment one of his advisors had pressed into his hand, only moments before the ceremony began. Later, Elira would learn that a messenger had arrived, that very evening warning of movement along the eastern border, a rival pack testing the edges of Northland territory, while the king's attention was fixed on his wedding. Heir Draven was a man split in two that night, half of him standing at an altar, half of him already planning a response to a threat he could not yet fully see. It was, perhaps, the only reason the deception worked as smoothly as it did. He was not looking closely at his bride. He was looking past her, toward the war he feared was coming. The priest's voice rolled through the hall, low and steady, reciting words about duty and unity, and the joining of two houses for the good of all their people. Elira kept her eyes down as she had been told, watching the hem of Heir's dark coat, the toe of his polished boot, anything but his face. When it came time to speak her vow, her voice came out smaller than she intended, and she prayed no one noticed how it did not sound quite like Dessa's. If Heir noticed, he gave no sign. He spoke his own vow in a voice that was calm and practiced, a man performing a duty he had accepted long before he ever met the woman standing across from him. When the priest instructed him to lift her veil, Elira's heart slammed so hard against her ribs that she was certain everyone in the hall could hear it. But the touch of his fingers against the fabric was brief, distracted, and the moment his eyes met hers beneath the veil, they held for only a second before sliding away again, back toward the doors, back toward whatever danger was gathering at the edge of his kingdom. He did not truly see her. Not that night, and in some strange, aching way, that was the thing Elira would remember most clearly, for years afterward. The most important night of her sister's life, and the man at the center of it had looked at her the way a person looks at the sky when they are thinking of something else entirely. The feast that followed was a blur of noise and color, of toasts raised in a language of celebration that felt entirely foreign to Elira's racing heart. She sat beside Cale at the head table, careful never to eat too much or speak too freely, watching him out of the corner of her eye, as generals leaned in to murmur reports against his ear. He answered each one with a short nod, a low word, his jaw tightening more with every passing hour. Whatever threat was building beyond the castle walls, it was pulling him further and further from the celebration, meant to mark the start of his marriage. Elira found herself studying him in those quiet, distracted moments, when he thought no one was watching. There was an exhaustion beneath his composure that surprised her, a weight that seemed far too heavy for a man his age to carry. She had expected a king who ruled through raw dominance, someone cold and untouchable. Instead, she saw a man holding an entire kingdom together with sheer will, someone who had likely not slept a full night in longer than he could remember. It would have been easier to hate him. It would have made everything simpler if he had been cruel, if he had barked orders at the servants or sneered at the guests who had traveled far to see the wedding. But he was courteous, even in his distraction, thanking each noble who approached the table, asking after the health of an elderly lord's wife, remembering the names of children he had apparently met only once, years earlier. Elira caught herself, more than once, forgetting for a moment that she was not supposed to be there at all. When the feast finally ended and the last of the guests had been ushered from the hall, Cale rose from his seat and extended a hand toward her without quite meeting her eyes. Elira took it, because she did not know what else to do, because refusing would have raised exactly the kind of suspicion her family had begged her to avoid. His hand was warm and much larger than hers, and the calluses along his palm spoke of years spent training with steel, rather than sitting on cushioned thrones. They walked together, through corridors lit by torches, past guards who bowed their heads as their king and new queen passed. Elira kept waiting for someone to stop them, for a servant to whisper that something was wrong, for the whole elaborate lie to collapse before they reached the chamber at the end of the hall. But nothing stopped them. The doors closed behind them, and for the first time all evening, Elira and Cale Draven were entirely alone. He crossed to the window and stood there for a long moment, looking out at the dark shapes of the mountains beyond the castle walls, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than it had been all night, stripped of the performance required by an audience. "I am sorry," he said, "if tonight felt cold to you. I did not choose the timing of this alliance, and I did not choose you as carelessly as it might have seemed. But there is a threat gathering at our border that I cannot ignore, even tonight, and I fear I have been a poor companion for what should have been a joyful evening." Elira did not know how to answer a man who was apologizing to her for a wedding built entirely on a lie he did not yet understand. She managed only a soft response, something about understanding the burdens of leadership, and he turned to look at her then, really look at her, for the first time since the ceremony began. Something flickered across his face, the faintest crease of confusion, as though some instinct beneath his exhaustion had noticed a detail that did not quite match his expectations. Elira held her breath, certain the truth was about to surface, right there in the candlelight. But whatever doubt had risen in him, he pushed it aside, perhaps telling himself that grief and nerves could change the shape of a familiar face, that a woman on her wedding night might look different than she had at a formal introduction weeks earlier. "I have heard," he said instead, "that you are quieter than I expected. Gentler." Elira thought of her sister Dessa, sharp-tongued and quick to laugh, nothing like the timid bride Cale believed he had married, and she understood in that moment just how little the two sisters had ever truly been compared, side by side, by the man now standing before her. It should have made her feel relieved. Instead, it made her feel like a stranger, wearing someone else's life, and the weight of that feeling would not leave her for a very long time. The night stretched on in a strange, careful silence between two people who did not know each other, one of them unaware of the depth of the deception surrounding him, the other trapped inside it with no clear way out. Elira told herself, again and again, that this was one night, one act of desperate loyalty to her family, and that by morning, the truth would somehow be corrected, gently, without anyone being harmed. She did not yet understand that some nights cannot be undone. She did not yet understand what she would carry forward from this chamber long after she left it, a secret far heavier than the one she had already agreed to keep. As the candles burned low and the mountains outside turned from black to the faint gray of approaching dawn, Elira Voss lay awake beside a king who did not know her name, already sensing, somewhere deep and wordless inside her, that her life had just been changed beyond anything her family had promised her when they asked this single favor of her. By the time the first birds began to call outside the window, she had made a private vow of her own, one she spoke to no one. Whatever came next, she would face it. She only wished, as she watched the light creep slowly across the stone floor, that she had some way of knowing just how far the consequences of this single night would eventually reach, and how completely they would reshape not only her own future, but the future of a kingdom that did not yet know she existed. Elira rose before the sun had fully cleared the mountains, moving as quietly as she could across the cold stone floor. Kale slept on, his face finally unguarded in a way it had not been all evening, and for a moment she allowed herself to study him without fear of being caught. He looked younger like this, less like a king carrying the weight of an entire people, and more like a man simply tired from a long and difficult season. She wondered, briefly, what kind of husband he might have been to a woman who had actually chosen to stand beside him. Then she pushed the thought away, because it did not belong to her, and never would. She dressed quickly in the plain traveling clothes her mother had hidden beneath a loose floorboard the night before, folding Dessa's wedding gown carefully, and leaving it draped across a chair, as though its owner had simply stepped out for air. A servant loyal to her family was waiting near a side door exactly where her mother had promised, and together they slipped through corridors still half asleep, past guards who had been awake all night, and were too weary to question a servant leading a cloaked woman toward the stables. Elira did not look back at the castle as she rode away from it. She told herself she was returning home, back to her family, back to whatever explanation they intended to offer once Dessa recovered enough to take her rightful place. She did not yet know that the version of home she was riding toward no longer existed, that the choices made in a single candlelit chamber had already begun to unravel the life she thought she was returning to, thread by thread, in ways she could not yet see. She only knew that behind her, in a castle built from stone and silver banners, a king slept without knowing the true name of the woman who had shared his wedding night. And ahead of her, though she could not have guessed it yet, waited a truth that would follow her far longer than any single dawn. Dessa Voss woke on the third morning of her fever, to find her body finally cooperating again, the burning in her limbs, replaced by a heavy, aching weakness. For a long moment she simply lay still, grateful to feel her own thoughts moving clearly, instead of swimming through the haze that had gripped her for days. Then the memory returned, sudden and sharp, and she sat up so fast that the room spun around her. The wedding. She had missed her own wedding. She called for her mother in a voice still rough from days of fever, and when Lady Voss appeared in the doorway, her face carried an expression Dessa had never seen on her before, something caught between relief and dread that made Dessa's stomach drop before a single word was spoken. "It is done," her mother said carefully, easing the door shut behind her. "The alliance is secure. The wedding took place as planned." Dessa stared at her, waiting for the explanation that would make sense of those words, and when her mother finally told her what had happened, Dessa felt the room tilt again, this time for reasons that had nothing to do with fever. Elira had stood in her place. Elira had spoken her vows. Elira had spent the night in the chamber of the Alpha King of the Northlands, while Dessa lay unconscious in her own bed, entirely unaware that her identity had been given away like a borrowed coat. "You let my sister marry him in my name," Dessa said slowly, and something in her voice made her mother flinch. "You let her stand there and lie to a king." "We had no choice," her mother said. "The treaty would have collapsed. Everything your father has built, everything this family depends on, all of it, would have unraveled if that wedding did not happen last night." Elira understood that. "She did this to protect us." Dessa pressed her hands against her face, trying to think through the throbbing in her skull, trying to imagine her quiet, careful sister standing in a hall full of strangers, vowing herself to a man neither of them had ever truly spoken to. "Where is she now?" Dessa asked. "Is she still there? Does he know?" "He does not know," her mother said. "Elira left before dawn. She is on her way home even now. Your father believes we can correct this quietly, once you are strong enough to travel. We will explain that illness delayed the ceremony, that a mistake was made with the timing, that the true bride is only now well enough to formally take her place." Dessa wanted to laugh, though nothing about the situation deserved laughter. "You cannot simply undo a wedding night," she said. "Whatever happened between Elira and that man happened. There is no quiet correction for that. There is only the truth, or a lie that grows heavier every day we keep telling it." Her mother's silence told Dessa everything she needed to know about which path the family intended to choose. By the time Elira returned home 2 days later, pale and hollow-eyed from the long ride, the family had already gathered in the study to decide her future, as though she were a piece on a board, rather than a person who had just lived through the most disorienting night of her life. Her father paced by the window, outlining plans in a low, urgent voice. Dessa would recover fully within the week. A message would be sent to the Northland court, explaining a sudden illness that had delayed the true bride's arrival. Elira would disappear quietly to a distant relative's estate, and in time, once enough seasons had passed, Dessa would travel north to formally take her place as queen, and no one beyond this room would ever need to know that the wedding vows had been spoken by the wrong sister. Elira sat in the corner of the study, listening to her own future being rewritten by people who had not thought to ask what she wanted from it. She had expected relief when she returned home, some acknowledgement of what she had sacrificed for the family's sake. Instead, she felt like a mistake being tidied away, a loose thread someone intended to snip and discard, before anyone noticed it had ever existed. "You are asking me to simply vanish," she finally said, and the room fell silent. "You are asking me to pretend none of this happened, while Dessa steps into a life I already lived for one night. What if he asks questions? What if there is something that cannot simply disappear when I leave this house?" Her father turned toward her sharply. "What do you mean?" Elira had not meant to say anything so soon, had not been ready to speak the fear that had been growing in her chest since the long ride home, the fear she had not yet dared to name even to herself. But something about the calm, businesslike way her family was rearranging her sacrifice into a convenient footnote made the words rise up before she could stop them. "I do not know yet," she admitted, "but I think you should prepare for the possibility that this cannot be undone as easily as you believe." The silence that followed was different from the silence before it, heavier, edged with a dread that settled over every face in the room. Her mother was the first to move, crossing the study to take Elira's hands in her own, searching her daughter's face as though the truth might be written somewhere in her expression. "Elira," her mother said carefully, "are you telling us there might be a child?" Elira had not intended to say it aloud so plainly, but once the question hung in the air, she found she could not deny it either. "I do not know for certain," she said. "It is too soon to know for certain, but it is possible. And if it is true, then the plan you are describing does not simply hide a mistake. It hides an heir to the Northland throne, and I do not think that is a secret any of us can carry quietly for long." Her father sank into the chair behind his desk, his face draining of color as the full weight of the situation settled over him. Dessa, who had remained silent through most of the conversation, finally spoke, her voice quieter and gentler than it had been since Elira returned. "If it is true," Dessa said, "then this is no longer only about the treaty. This is about a person who does not exist yet, but who already has more claim to that throne than either of us. We cannot simply hide her away in some distant estate and hope no one ever asks the right question." For the first time since the wedding, Elira felt something shift in the room, a recognition, however reluctant, that the situation had grown far larger than a family trying to protect its own reputation. Her father asked question after question, about timing, about how soon they would know for certain, about what could be done if the fear proved true. Elira answered as best she could, though the truth was that she did not yet know how to feel about any of it, whether fear or something quieter and more complicated was rising beneath her ribs whenever she let herself imagine the shape of what might be growing inside her. Over the following days, the household moved through a strange, careful tension, every conversation circling the same unspoken question, without anyone willing to say it plainly at the dinner table. Alira watched her parents exchange glances across the room, watched Dessa grow quieter and more thoughtful than her usual sharp self, and felt, more than ever, like a stranger inside her own family's plans. It was Dessa, in the end, who came to her one evening as the rest of the household slept, sitting on the edge of Alira's bed with an expression Alira had not seen on her sister's face before, something that looked almost like guilt. "I should have been the one standing in that hall," Dessa said quietly. "I should have been the one lying awake wondering what comes next. Instead you carried it for me, and now you may be carrying something far heavier than either of us imagined that night." Alira did not know how to answer, so she said nothing, and Dessa reached over to take her hand in the dark. "Whatever happens," Dessa said, "I will not let them hide you away like something shameful. If there is a child, that child deserves better than to be treated like a secret to bury, and so do you." Alira wanted to believe her sister meant every word, and in that quiet moment, she did believe it. But she had also lived long enough inside this family to know how easily good intentions bent beneath the pressure of politics and reputation, how quickly a promise made in the dark could soften into something else entirely once daylight returned, and her father's advisors began weighing the family's future against the cost of the truth. Within a fortnight, her fears were confirmed. A physician summoned quietly under the pretense of treating a minor illness, examined Alira, and delivered the news to her parents, in hushed, careful tones, though the walls of the house were thin enough that Alira heard every word from the next room. "She is with child. There is no doubt remaining." The household shifted immediately into a new kind of urgency, one far more consuming than the frantic scramble that had produced the wedding itself. Her father spoke of sending her far away, to a distant cousin's holding near the coast, somewhere no one from the Northland court would ever think to look. Her mother spoke of finding some way to eventually present the child as Dessa's own, born of a delayed marriage rather than a single deceptive night. Dessa, to her credit, argued against every plan that involved erasing Alira from her own child's life, but her voice was only one among several, and the decisions being made no longer seemed to include Alira's opinion at all. It was on a quiet afternoon, sitting alone in the garden, while her family argued behind closed doors about her future, and the future of the child she now knew, without any remaining doubt, that she carried, that Alira finally understood something with complete clarity. No plan her family devised would ever fully protect this child, because every plan was built first around protecting the family's reputation, and only second, if at all, around protecting the small, unformed life now depending entirely on her. She thought of Cale Draven, the way his hand had felt warm and calloused around hers, the tired honesty in his voice when he apologized for a wedding he did not yet know had been built on a lie. She thought of the flicker of confusion that had crossed his face when he lifted her veil, the instinct in him that had noticed something was not quite right, even if he had not yet had the reason to trust it. If he ever learned the truth, if he ever discovered that a woman he had never truly seen was carrying a child with claim to his throne, what kind of man would he become? Would he demand the child be brought to him, torn from the only parent it had ever known? Would he see Alira only as the instrument of a deception that had humiliated him before his entire court, and treat the child accordingly? Or would there be some part of him, the same part that had softened when he spoke of the weight of his duties, that might have room for gentleness, even inside the wreckage of a broken trust? Alira did not know the answer, and she realized, sitting in the fading afternoon light, with one hand resting instinctively over her stomach, that she was not willing to risk her child's safety to find out. Whatever plan her family eventually settled on, she decided in that quiet garden that she would not simply hand her future, or her child's future, over to people who had already proven how easily they could rearrange her life to suit their own convenience. That night, long after the house had gone silent, Alira lay awake staring at the ceiling, turning over the beginnings of a plan that belonged entirely to her, one she had not yet spoken aloud to anyone, not even Dessa. She did not yet know exactly where she would go, or how she would survive once she left the only home she had ever known. She only knew, with a certainty that settled deep and unshakable in her chest, that she would not let this child grow up as a secret her family managed for their own benefit. If she was going to disappear, she would decide the terms of that disappearance herself, and she would carry her child somewhere far beyond the reach of a family that had already shown her exactly how much her own wishes weighed against the family's careful, self-serving plans. The plan that finally left Alira's lips at the family dinner table 3 weeks later was not the plan her parents had spent those weeks perfecting. It was her own, spoken calmly and without hesitation, and the certainty in her voice silenced the room faster than any argument could have. "I will leave before anyone decides where I should go," she said. "I will choose the place myself, and I will not tell any of you where it is." Her father set down his fork with a sharp clink against the plate. "That is not a decision you make alone, Elira. You are carrying a child with a claim to a throne. This is not only your future at stake." "It is my body," Elira answered, "and my child, and I have spent every day since that wedding night, watching this family decide my future, without asking what I wanted from it. I will not do the same to my child. Whatever happens next, I will be the one who decides." Her mother's eyes filled with tears, though whether from fear or something closer to shame, Elira could not tell. Dessa, seated across the table, said nothing at first, only studied her sister with an expression that had grown more thoughtful, more searching, in the weeks since the physician's confirmation. When Dessa finally spoke, her voice carried a weight Elira had not expected. "If you go," Dessa said, "I want to know you are safe, even if I do not know where you are." It was the closest thing to permission Elira received that night, and she took it, because she understood by then that permission from anyone else was not something she truly needed. The weeks that followed moved with a strange, careful quiet, Elira gathering what she could without drawing attention. A little coin here, a traveling cloak there, a plain gown that would let her pass unnoticed among ordinary people rather than marking her as the daughter of a noble house. She studied maps in her father's study late at night, tracing routes that led away from both her family's lands and the Northland border, toward settlements far enough removed from either territory that no one would think to search for a missing bride there. She chose in the end a town called Fenmore, 3 weeks' journey south, built along a wide river, and known mostly for its trade in wool and grain, rather than politics or power. It was the kind of place where a quiet young widow with a small income might settle without anyone asking too many questions about her past, and Elira had already begun, in her mind, to build the story she would tell when questions inevitably came. Dessa helped her prepare in ways their parents never learned about, slipping extra coin into Elira's traveling bag, teaching her simple herbal remedies that might help through the difficult months ahead, sitting with her late at night to practice the careful, steady voice of a woman who had lost a husband to illness, rather than a sister who had lost her place in her own family's plans. It was during those quiet nights that the sisters grew closer than they had been in years, closer perhaps than they had ever been, bonded now by a secret far heavier than any they had shared as children. "I wish there was another way," Dessa admitted one night, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wish I could go with you." "You cannot," Elira said gently. "Someone has to remain here to hold this family together, and to keep watch in case anyone from the Northlands ever comes asking questions. I need you here, Dessa. I need someone who knows the truth, and will not let it be twisted into something smaller and easier to manage." Dessa nodded, though her eyes were bright with tears she refused to let fall. "I will never let them pretend this did not happen," she promised. "Whatever they decide to tell the world, I will always know the truth, and I will carry it as carefully as you are carrying everything else." The night Elira finally left, she rose in the hour before dawn, just as she had risen from Kale's chamber months earlier, and the symmetry of it was not lost on her as she moved silently through the dark house one last time. She paused outside her parents' door, listening to the faint sound of her father's breathing, and felt a complicated grief settle over her, not quite forgiveness, not quite anger, something unresolved, that she suspected she would carry for a very long time. Dessa was waiting by the stable, already awake, already dressed, despite the early hour, and she pressed a small leather pouch into Elira's hands without a word. Inside, Elira would later discover, was more coin than she had expected, along with a small silver pendant that had belonged to their grandmother, a woman neither sister had ever met but whose memory their mother had always spoken of with quiet reverence. "For the child," Dessa said simply. "So they will always have something that connects them to where they came from, even if they never know the whole story." Elira embraced her sister for a long moment, memorizing the shape of it, the warmth of Dessa's arms around her, the smell of the lavender soap she had always favored since they were girls. When they finally separated, neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to say that would not break the fragile composure both of them were fighting to hold on to. The horse Elira had arranged, a sturdy, unremarkable animal, chosen specifically for its ordinary appearance, waited saddled and ready at the edge of the property. She mounted carefully, one hand resting briefly against the small, still barely noticeable curve of her stomach, and looked back one final time at the house where she had spent her entire life, its windows dark, its shape familiar against the fading stars. Then she turned the horse toward the southern road and rode away, before the sun had fully risen, just as she had done once before, though this time there was no wedding gown folded neatly on a chair behind her, no family waiting to explain away her absence. This time, she was choosing the path herself, and though fear rode alongside her every mile of that long, uncertain journey, so did something else, something that felt almost like the first true freedom she had known since the night her father asked her to stand in her sister's place. The journey to Fenmore took longer than she expected, slowed by the caution she forced herself to maintain at every stop, every inn, every crossroads where a stranger's curious glance might linger a moment too long. She traveled under the name Elira Marsh, a small alteration that felt safe enough to remember easily, while distant enough from her true name to avoid drawing connections. She told innkeepers and fellow travelers that she was a young widow traveling to live near distant relatives, a story simple enough to invite little further questioning, and she found, to her quiet relief, that most people accepted it without a second thought. There were moments along the road when fear pressed so heavily against her chest that she considered turning back, moments when the vastness of what she was attempting, raising a child entirely alone, far from everyone she had ever known, felt impossibly large. But each time that fear rose, she thought of the child growing inside her, of the life she was trying to protect from becoming nothing more than a bargaining piece in someone else's political game, and the fear settled into something steadier, something closer to resolve. By the time she reached Fenmore, 3 weeks after leaving her family's house in the dark, she was exhausted in a way that reached far past her body, worn thin by grief and uncertainty, and the sheer effort of holding herself together through every mile. But the town, when she finally rode into it, offered something she had not expected to find so quickly, a kind of quiet, unremarkable normalcy that felt, after everything, almost like relief. She found a small cottage on the edge of town, owned by an elderly widow named Greta who was glad for the company and the modest rent Elira could offer from the coin Dessa had given her. She found a healer in the town center, a woman named Mira Doyle with kind eyes and careful hands, who examined her without judgment and promised to see her through whatever months lay ahead. And slowly, cautiously, Elira began to build the outline of a life that belonged entirely to her, far from thrones and treaties and the careful, self-serving calculations of a family that had once decided her future without asking her opinion. She did not yet know what kind of life awaited the child she carried, whether the shadow of the Northland throne would ever reach far enough south to find them, or whether she had truly succeeded in carrying her secret beyond the boundaries where anyone might think to look. But as she settled into the small cottage at the edge of Fenmore, watching the last light of another long day fade over the river, she allowed herself, for the first time in months, to imagine a future that was not shaped entirely by fear. Winter came early to Fenmore that year, wrapping the small town in a cold that settled deep into the stone walls of every cottage along the river. Elira spent those months learning the rhythms of a life she had never expected to live, rising before dawn to help Greta with the small tasks of the household, walking to the market with a basket over her arm like any other young widow, nodding politely to neighbors who had slowly, cautiously, begun to accept her as one of their own. It was strange, she often thought, how quickly a person could build an entirely new identity out of small, repeated gestures, a familiar route to the well, a regular seat at the back of the town chapel, a habit of buying bread from the same baker every third morning. None of it erased who she had been before, but it created something new to stand alongside the memory, a life that belonged to Elira Marsh rather than Elira Voss, a life where no one looked at her and thought of thrones or treaties, or a wedding built on a lie. The child grew steadily within her through those cold months, and Mira Doyle, the town healer, became one of the few people Elira allowed herself to trust with anything close to the truth. Not the whole truth, not the names or the titles that would have brought danger crashing down on both of them, but enough that Mira understood this was a woman, running from something larger than the ordinary grief of widowhood, and Mira, to her credit, never pressed for more than Elira was willing to give. "You carry yourself like someone who has more to protect than just this baby," Mira said one evening, as she checked the steady rhythm of Elira's heartbeat, her fingers gentle and sure. "I do not need to know everything, but I want you to know that whatever you are running from, you are safe here. This town keeps its own secrets well enough." Elira never forgot the kindness in those words, spoken plainly, without demand for explanation, and in the months that followed, Mira became something closer to family than Elira had expected to find, so far from everyone she had once known. The baby came in the deep cold of late winter, on a night when snow fell so thickly that Greta had to send her neighbor's son running through the storm to fetch Mira from the other side of town. Elira labored through the long hours of that night, with only Greta's steady hands, and murmured encouragement to hold on to, until finally, near dawn, Mira arrived breathless and snow-dusted, just in time to guide the birth through its final, difficult hour. When the cry finally came, sharp and strong in the quiet cottage, Elira felt something inside her break open and reshape itself entirely, grief and fear and months of careful loneliness dissolving, for one suspended moment, into something that felt almost like joy. Mira placed the baby in her arms, a boy, small and red-faced, and furious at the cold air of the world he had just entered, and Elira looked down at him and felt, with a certainty that startled her, that every difficult choice she had made since that wedding night had led, somehow, to this exact moment. She named him Ronan, a name she had chosen months earlier during long, sleepless nights of turning over possibilities, one that carried no obvious connection to either her family or Cale's, one that could belong entirely to the boy himself, rather than to the complicated history of the two houses that had, without ever meeting, created him. The early months of Ronan's life passed in the particular exhaustion and wonder that Elira had heard other mothers describe, but had never truly understood until she lived it herself. She learned the shape of his cries, which meant hunger, and which meant simple restlessness, learned the way he settled fastest against her shoulder in the deep hours of the night, learned to recognize, with a growing unease she tried to push aside, that there was something different about him, even from his earliest weeks. He rarely startled at loud noises the way other infants did. His eyes, when they finally settled into their true color, a warm amber gold that reminded Elira, uncomfortably, of a color she had glimpsed once beneath a veil in a candlelit hall, seemed to track movement across a room, with an attentiveness that felt almost unnatural for a child so young. Mira noticed it too, though she said little beyond a few careful observations, and Elira understood, without either of them needing to say it plainly, that the healer suspected exactly whose blood ran through the boy's veins, even if she never asked the question directly. "He is strong," Mira said once, watching Ronan grip her finger with a force that seemed impossible for an infant only weeks old. "Stronger than most." Elira only nodded, her heart tight with a fear she had known was coming since the day she first confirmed her pregnancy, the fear that no amount of distance or careful hiding could fully erase the truth written into her son's very blood. She had chosen Fenmore for its distance from both her family's lands and the Northland border, had chosen a life built on quiet routine, specifically to avoid drawing the kind of attention that might eventually lead someone back to the truth. But watching Ronan grow, watching the small, unmistakable signs of his heritage emerge even in infancy, she understood that distance alone might not be enough, that she would need to be far more careful, far more watchful than she had perhaps first believed. Word from her family reached her rarely, carried through a careful, roundabout system Dessa had arranged months before Elira left. Letters passed through a merchant who traveled regularly between their territories, addressed to a false name Elira had given her sister before she departed. Through those letters, delivered every few months, Elira learned that her family had managed, through careful diplomacy and a story about a delayed illness, to eventually present Dessa formally to the Northland court as the true bride, though the wedding that finally took place between Dessa and Cale Draven was never quite what either family had originally envisioned. Dessa's letters were careful, guarded against the possibility of discovery, but between the careful lines Elira could read the strain her sister carried, the difficulty of stepping into a marriage that had already been complicated beyond repair, by events Dessa had not chosen, and could not fully explain to the husband she now shared a life with. "Cale remains distant," Dessa wrote in one letter that Elira read and reread until the parchment softened at its folds. "He does not speak of the wedding night, though I sense he remembers something about it that does not match what he was told. I do not know if he suspects the truth, or only feels a confusion he cannot name. I am trying, in my own way, to be a good wife to him, though I fear the foundation of this marriage will always carry a crack neither of us can fully see." Elira read those words with a complicated grief she had not expected, sympathy for her sister trapped in a marriage, built on a lie neither of them had chosen freely, and a quieter, more private ache for the man at the center of it, a man who had once apologized to her for a wedding he did not yet understand, had been stolen from its true intended shape. She wondered, sometimes, late at night, with Ronan sleeping soundly against her chest, whether Cale ever thought of that first night, whether some instinct in him recognized that the woman he remembered from the darkness of that chamber did not quite match the wife who now shared his life. She told herself, again and again, that it did not matter, that the life she had built for Ronan in Fenmore was safer and simpler than anything he could have known, as a hidden secret within the Northland court. She watched him grow through that first year, with a fierce, protective love that steadied her through every quiet fear. Watched him take his first uncertain steps across Greta's cottage floor. Watched him begin to speak his first words, in a voice that already carried, even at that young age, a strange note of calm authority that made grown neighbors pause and smile in surprise. "He is going to be someone important," Greta told her once, watching Ronan toddle confidently across the garden despite his young age, reaching for a fallen branch as though it were a tool rather than a toy. "Mark my words, that boy carries himself like he already knows exactly who he is." Elira only smiled and said nothing, though the words settled into her chest with a weight that never fully left her. She knew, better than anyone in Fenmore, exactly how true Greta's careless observation actually was, and exactly how much danger might eventually follow from a boy who could not fully hide the truth of his own blood, no matter how carefully his mother tried to shelter him from the world that had once, briefly, claimed him as its heir. In the Northlands, Cale Draven had learned, over the 2 years since his wedding, to live with a question he could never quite silence. It was not a loud doubt, not the kind that demanded immediate answers, but a quiet, persistent unease that surfaced most often in the stillness before sleep, when the noise of council meetings and border disputes finally faded and left him alone with his own thoughts. Something about that first night had never settled correctly in his memory. He remembered a voice smaller and gentler than he expected, a woman who had flinched at his touch in a way that felt less like nerves and more like genuine surprise, as though she had not fully anticipated the shape of the night ahead of her. He remembered, too, the strange, fleeting moment when he lifted her veil, a flicker of something in her eyes that did not match the calm, composed woman he had been introduced to weeks earlier, during the formal negotiations between their two houses. He had dismissed it at the time, distracted as he was by the reports of movement along the eastern border, by the war he had feared was coming, and had spent that entire wedding night quietly preparing to meet. But 2 years later, watching Dessa move through the halls of his castle, with a confidence and sharpness that felt, in every way, more genuine than the timid warmth he remembered from that first night, the question resurfaced, with a persistence he could no longer easily dismiss. Dessa was not unkind to him. If anything, she had proven herself a capable and thoughtful partner in the difficult work of ruling a kingdom, still recovering from years of border conflict, offering counsel he had come to genuinely value, managing the complicated politics of the court with a skill that had earned the respect of even his most skeptical advisors. But there remained, between them, a distance neither had ever fully closed, a formality that never softened into the ease Cale had once hoped a marriage might eventually develop, and he found himself, more and more often, comparing the wife who shared his throne to the fleeting, half-remembered impression of the woman who had shared his wedding night. It was his general, Corwin, a broad-shouldered man who had served the Draven line since Cale's father ruled the Northlands, who finally gave voice to the suspicion Cale had been carrying alone for so long. They sat together late one evening in Cale's private study, maps of the border territories spread across the table between them, when Corwin set down his cup and studied his king, with the blunt honesty only their long friendship allowed. "You still think of it," Corwin said. "The wedding night." Cale did not bother denying it. "Something about it has never sat right with me," he admitted. "I cannot explain what, exactly. Only that the woman I remember from that night, and the woman who now sits beside me at court, do not feel like the same person." Corwin was quiet for a long moment, turning his cup slowly between his hands. "There have been whispers," he said finally, careful in the way a man chooses his words when he suspects they might carry weight he cannot fully predict, among the older servants who worked the wedding feast. Whispers that the bride who arrived that night seemed different from the woman the court had met during the earlier negotiations. Quieter, more easily startled. Some assumed it was simple nerves, the natural fear of a woman about to marry a king she barely knew. But others have wondered. Cale felt something cold settle in his chest, a suspicion he had carried privately for so long, finally given shape and voice by another person, which made it somehow impossible to continue ignoring. "What are you suggesting, Corwin?" "I am suggesting nothing," Corwin said carefully. "I am only telling you what has reached my ears, because I believe you deserve to know it, whatever it might mean. If there is a simple explanation, some misunderstanding born of nerves and fever and the chaos of that particular night, then no harm comes from asking the question plainly. But if there is something more, something the Voss family chose to hide from you, then I believe you have every right to know the truth, whatever consequences follow from it." Cale sat with those words long after Corwin had left the study, staring at the maps spread across his table without truly seeing them, his mind circling back again and again to that first night, to the flicker of confusion in a veiled stranger's eyes, to 2 years of quiet distance, with a wife who had never quite matched the fragments of memory he carried from their wedding. He summoned Dessa to his study the following evening, choosing his words carefully, watching her face closely, as he finally asked the question he had avoided for 2 years. "Dessa," he said, "tell me honestly, was there any illness, any delay, anything unusual surrounding the arrangements of our wedding that I was never told about?" He watched something shift behind her eyes, a flicker of alarm quickly masked by the careful composure she had spent 2 years perfecting as queen, and in that single unguarded moment, Cale understood, with a certainty that settled like ice through his veins, that there was indeed a truth he had never been told. Dessa did not answer immediately, and the silence stretched long enough that it became its own kind of confession. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, careful, the voice of a woman choosing which parts of a difficult truth she was willing to share. "Very ill, in the days before our wedding, I could not stand, let alone walk the length of a wedding hall. My family feared that if the ceremony did not proceed as scheduled, the alliance between our houses would collapse entirely, and everything both our families had worked toward would be lost." Cale felt his pulse quicken, a dangerous, mounting anger building beneath the careful stillness he forced himself to maintain. "What did your family do, Dessa?" "My sister stood in my place," Dessa said, and the words seemed to cost her something significant to speak aloud after 2 years of careful silence. "Elira. She spoke the vows meant for me. She spent that first night in your chamber, believing it would only be for a single night, believing our family would find a way to correct the mistake before anyone learned the truth. By the time I recovered enough to take my rightful place, the situation had already grown far too complicated to simply undo." The study fell into a silence so complete that Cale could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, a rage rising in him unlike anything he had felt in years, not merely at the deception itself, but at the 2 years he had spent married to a woman who had known this truth from the very beginning and had chosen, every single day, to let him remain ignorant of it. "You let me believe a lie for 2 years, he said finally, his voice low and dangerous, in a way that made Dessa flinch. "You stood beside me at court, shared my table, shared decisions about the future of this kingdom, all while knowing that the wedding itself, the very foundation of our marriage, was built on a deception your family orchestrated to save their own political standing." "I did not choose the deception," Dessa said, her voice gaining a thread of steel despite the fear plainly visible on her face. "It was decided before I ever regained consciousness, before I had any say in what my family chose to do. By the time I understood what had happened, the wedding was already complete, and correcting it would have exposed my sister to a scandal that could have destroyed her entirely, along with the treaty both our families depended on. I made an imperfect choice within an impossible situation, and I have lived every day since carrying the weight of it." Cale rose from his chair and crossed to the window, staring out at the dark shapes of the mountains beyond his castle, the same view he had studied on his wedding night, while apologizing to a woman he now understood he had never truly met. "Where is she?" he asked finally, without turning around. "Your sister. Where is Elira now?" "I do not know," Dessa admitted, and something in her voice suggested this, at least, was entirely true. She left before dawn the morning after the wedding, and she chose, deliberately, not to tell any of us where she intended to go. She feared, I think, what our family might decide to do with her once the truth became known, and she wanted to protect herself from becoming a pawn in whatever political maneuvering followed. Cale stood at that window for a long time, his anger slowly settling into something colder and more complicated, a tangle of betrayal and confusion, and a strange, unwelcome grief for a woman he had spent only a single night with, and had somehow, without ever fully understanding why, never quite managed to forget. He thought of sending trackers south immediately, of demanding answers from the Voss family, of every furious, decisive action a wounded king might take to reclaim control over a situation that had spiraled entirely beyond his knowledge for 2 long years. But something held him back, some quiet instinct, beneath the anger, that recognized how little he actually understood about the woman at the center of this deception, about her reasons, about whatever fears had driven her to vanish so completely, rather than remain, and face the consequences of a truth her family had forced upon her. He was not yet ready to chase after a woman he believed, in that raw first hour of discovery, had participated willingly in humiliating him before his entire court, even if some quieter part of him suspected the truth might be far more complicated than simple betrayal. For now, he told Dessa only that their marriage would continue as it had, that the political necessity of their union had not changed regardless of the deception surrounding its beginning, though something between them had shifted permanently in that single conversation, a fragile trust broken in a way that would take far longer than either of them yet understood to even begin repairing. And in the private hours that followed, alone in the same chamber where he had once shared a single night with a stranger, wearing his true wife's name, Cale Draven found himself thinking, again and again, of a woman who had vanished into the world before dawn, carrying with her a truth he was only now beginning to understand, he desperately needed to uncover. 6 years passed in Fenmore, with a steadiness that Alira had once feared she would never find again, each season folding quietly into the next, each year bringing small, ordinary changes that felt, in their accumulation, like an entire lifetime built from nothing but careful patience. Ronan grew from a watchful infant into a bright, quick-eyed boy who moved through the town with an easy confidence that made him a favorite among the other children, even as certain qualities about him continued to set him gently apart. He ran faster than boys twice his age. He noticed things other children missed entirely, the change in weather hours before the clouds actually gathered, the presence of a stranger in town before anyone else had spotted them crossing the bridge, the particular tension in an adult's voice that signaled worry long before words confirmed it. Elira watched these small signs accumulate over the years with a careful, quiet vigilance, teaching Ronan, as gently as she could, the importance of restraint, of blending in, of never drawing more attention than necessary toward himself. "You are stronger than the other children," she told him once, when he was old enough to understand such conversations, sitting with him in the garden behind Greta's cottage as the evening light faded gold across the grass. "That is not something to be ashamed of, but it is something to be careful with. Some gifts are safer kept quiet until the world is ready to understand them." Ronan, even at that young age, seemed to absorb her caution with an intuition beyond his years, nodding seriously, asking few questions, adjusting his behavior around others, with a discipline that both reassured and quietly unsettled Elira in equal measure. He was, in every visible way, a well-behaved and thoughtful child, but she often caught him watching the world with an intensity that reminded her, uncomfortably, of a man she had spent only a single night beside, years earlier, in a candle-lit chamber far to the north. Mira Doyle remained a steady presence throughout those years, her friendship with Elira deepening into something closer to family, as the healer watched Ronan grow from infancy into boyhood, offering quiet support through every small crisis, every childhood fever, every ordinary worry that came with raising a child alone in an unfamiliar town. It was Mira, more than anyone besides Elira herself, who understood how carefully Ronan's true nature needed to be managed, and she never once pressed for details about his father, respecting the boundary Elira had drawn around that particular truth, even as the years deepened their friendship in every other way. Letters from Dessa continued to arrive several times each year, carried through the same careful merchant network the sisters had established before Elira left, and through those letters, Elira followed the slow, complicated unfolding of her sister's life at the Northland court. She learned of the tension that had settled permanently into Dessa's marriage after Cale finally learned the truth of the wedding night, a tension neither husband nor wife had ever managed to fully resolve, though they had built, over the years, a functional and respectful partnership focused primarily on the responsibilities of ruling their shared kingdom, rather than any deeper intimacy between them. "He asked about you again," Dessa wrote in one particularly difficult letter, received during Ronan's 5th year. "He does not speak your name often, but I can tell the question of where you went and what became of you has never fully left him. I do not know what he suspects about the timing of your disappearance, whether he has ever considered the possibility that you might have carried something more than memory away from that single night. I have not told him, Elira, though the secret grows heavier each year I carry it alongside my own. I do not know how much longer I can hold this silence without it costing me something I am not prepared to lose." Elira read that letter with a familiar tightness gathering in her chest, the old fear that had never fully left her despite 6 years of careful distance and quiet routine. She wrote back reassuring her sister, thanking her for her continued discretion, insisting that the secret remained safest, exactly where it currently rested, hidden and unspoken, far from the political complications that would surely follow if the truth of Ronan's existence ever reached the Northland court. But even as she wrote those reassurances, some quieter part of her recognized the growing difficulty of maintaining such careful control over a truth that seemed to want, with every passing year, to reveal itself in small, unavoidable ways. Ronan's resemblance to a father he had never met grew more pronounced with each passing season, not merely in the color of his eyes or the shape of his jaw, but in mannerisms Elira could not explain, a particular way of standing with his shoulders squared and steady, a habit of studying a room's exits before settling comfortably into any new space, small unconscious echoes of a man Ronan had never once seen. It was during Ronan's 6th year that the first true test of their careful hiding arrived, unannounced and unexpected, in the form of a group of traveling merchants who passed through Fenmore on their way south. Merchants whose caravan included, among its guards, several men who had once served in the Northland territories before seeking work further from the political tensions of their home region. Elira noticed them the moment they arrived in town, recognized something in their bearing, the particular discipline of movement that marked them as trained warriors rather than ordinary traders, and felt the old fear rise sharply in her chest for the first time in years. She kept Ronan close during the days the caravan remained in Fenmore, inventing reasons to keep him occupied within Greta's garden, rather than allowing him his usual freedom to roam the town with his friends, watching carefully from the cottage windows as the merchants conducted their business in the market square below. It was on the 2nd evening of their stay that her caution nearly failed her entirely, when Ronan, restless after 2 days confined to the small garden, slipped away, while Elira was occupied helping Greta prepare the evening meal, wandering down toward the town square, where the caravan's guards had gathered near their fire. Elira discovered his absence within minutes and hurried toward the square, in a panic she fought to keep from showing on her face, arriving just in time to see Ronan standing near the edge of the merchant's fire, engaged in an easy, animated conversation with one of the guards, a broad-shouldered man who was watching the boy with an expression of growing, unmistakable curiosity. She reached them quickly, calling Ronan's name with a lightness she did not fully feel, and the boy turned toward her with the easy smile of a child who had simply been enjoying a friendly conversation, entirely unaware of the danger his mother had spent years working to shield him from. The guard, however, continued studying Ronan, even as Elira drew him gently away, his eyes narrowing slightly, some flicker of recognition crossing his weathered face that made Elira's heart pound with a fear she had not felt so sharply in years. "That boy carries himself like the young lords of the Northland court," the guard said, his voice carrying just far enough for Elira to hear, as she led Ronan quickly away from the fire. Strange, to see that particular bearing so far south. Elira did not respond, keeping her pace steady and unhurried despite the panic racing beneath her calm exterior, and she did not breathe easily again until she and Ronan were safely back inside Greta's cottage, the door firmly shut behind them. That night, after Ronan had finally settled into sleep, Elira sat alone by the dying fire, turning over the guard's careless observation again and again in her mind, understanding, with a clarity that felt both terrifying and inevitable, that Fenmore's isolation would not protect them forever. The world was larger and more interconnected than she had perhaps allowed herself to believe during the comfortable, quiet years of Ronan's early childhood, and sooner or later, someone with sharper eyes and a stronger connection to the Northland court would look at her son and see, unmistakably, exactly whose blood ran through his veins. She did not sleep at all that night, watching the fire burn slowly down to embers, while she considered, for the first time in years, whether the careful, hidden life she had built for Ronan could truly last much longer, or whether the truth she had spent 6 years protecting him from was already, quietly and inevitably, beginning to find its way back toward them both. In the Northlands, the years since Chaol's discovery had not been kind to the kingdom he had inherited from his father. What had once been a territory secure in its borders and confident in its future, had slowly, steadily, begun to feel the strain of a throne without a clear line of succession, a weakness that rival packs along the eastern and western borders had grown increasingly bold in testing. Chaol and Dessa had no children of their own, a fact that had become, over the years, one of the most quietly discussed vulnerabilities within the Northland court, whispered about among advisors who understood exactly how dangerous an uncertain succession could become for a kingdom already surrounded by ambitious neighbors. Chaol had never spoken publicly about the reasons behind this absence, had never explained to his court the distance that had settled permanently between himself and his wife since the night he learned the truth of their wedding, but the whispers grew louder each year regardless, and the pressure from his advisors grew correspondingly more difficult to ignore. "You must consider taking a second wife," his most senior advisor, a careful, aging man named Aldrich, told him plainly during one particularly tense council session. "Whether through formal separation from Queen Dessa, or through arrangements our laws permit for a king whose first marriage has produced no heir, something must be done, Your Grace. Bastion Thorn grows bolder along our western border every season, and he will not hesitate to press his advantage the moment he senses true weakness in our line of succession." Bastion Thorn, the ambitious alpha of a neighboring pack that had spent years quietly expanding its territory at the edges of Northland influence, had indeed grown increasingly aggressive in recent seasons, testing border patrols, disputing old land agreements, positioning himself, gradually and carefully, as a genuine threat to Northland stability. Chaol understood the danger Aldrich described perfectly well, understood that a kingdom without a clear heir was a kingdom inviting exactly the kind of challenge Bastion Thorn seemed increasingly eager to offer, but something in him resisted every suggestion of taking a second wife with a stubbornness he could not fully explain even to himself. It was not loyalty to Dessa that held him back, though he had come, over the years, to genuinely respect her as a capable partner in ruling the kingdom, despite the distance that remained between them. It was something else entirely, a persistent, unresolved thread that had never fully released its grip on him since the night he learned the truth of his wedding, a quiet, unshakable curiosity about the woman who had actually stood beside him that first night, who had vanished before dawn, carrying a secret he had spent years, slowly, painfully piecing together. He had made inquiries over the years, careful and discreet, sending trusted men to search for any trace of Alira Voss across the southern territories, where he suspected she might have fled. Most of those inquiries had returned nothing, the trail long cold, the woman seemingly vanished entirely from any record his searchers could uncover. But in recent months, a new thread had emerged, faint and uncertain, carried back to him through a merchant contact who had heard rumors, second-hand and unreliable, of a woman matching Alira's description, who had settled years earlier in a small river town called Fenmore, far to the south. Chaol had not yet acted on this new information, uncertain whether it represented a genuine lead or simply another false trail among the many he had already exhausted over the years. But the rumor had settled into him with a weight he could not easily dismiss, reawakening a question that had never fully quieted since the night Dessa first confessed the truth of their wedding. It was during this same difficult season that a new source of tension arrived at the Northland court, in the form of increasingly urgent reports from patrols along the southern trade routes, reports of a young boy who had been spotted, on more than one occasion, displaying abilities and bearing that seemed distinctly unusual for an ordinary human child in the territories beyond Northland borders. The reports were vague, second-hand, easily dismissed as exaggeration or rumor, but they arrived with enough consistency over several months that Corwin, Cale's loyal general, finally brought them directly to his king's attention. "There have been whispers among the border patrols," Corwin said carefully, choosing his words with the same deliberate caution he had used years earlier, when first raising the question of Cale's wedding night. "A boy, seen in several southern territories over recent months, said to display strength and instincts unusual for his apparent age. Some of the patrol guards who reported these sightings previously served under our banner, Your Grace. They recognized something in this boy's bearing that reminded them of our own royal line." Cale felt something shift in his chest at those words, a suspicion beginning to form that he almost feared to name even privately, connecting the rumor of a woman settled in Fenmore with these scattered reports of an unusual boy glimpsed in the southern territories. He had done the careful mathematics many times over the years, quietly, privately, calculating the months between his wedding night and whatever timeline might explain a child born from that single encounter, and the possibility that had haunted the edges of his thoughts for years suddenly felt far less distant, far more urgently real than it ever had before. "Send trusted men south," Cale instructed Corwin that same evening, his voice carrying a controlled intensity that made the general study him carefully, discreetly. "I want to know everything that can be learned about this boy, and about the woman these merchants claim has been living quietly in Fenmore these past several years. I want confirmation before I act on rumor alone. But I want that confirmation quickly, Corwin. This cannot wait through another season of uncertainty." Corwin nodded, understanding without further explanation exactly what his king suspected, and within days, a small group of carefully chosen trackers departed the Northland court, under the cover of routine trade business, traveling south toward Fenmore, with instructions to observe quietly, to confirm what they could, and to report back before taking any further action that might alert the woman and boy to the attention now gathering around them. Meanwhile, at court, the pressure from Aldrich and the other advisors continued to mount, the threat from Bastion Thorn's western territory growing more pressing with each passing week, until finally, during a tense council session that stretched long into the evening, Aldrich raised the question directly before the full assembled council, rather than in the private conversations he had previously favored. "Your Grace," Aldrich said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who understood he was taking a significant risk in pressing this matter so publicly, "the kingdom cannot continue much longer without a clear line of succession. Whatever personal reasons have kept you from resolving this matter, I must ask you, before this entire council, to consider what continued delay risks for every person under Northland protection. Bastion Thorn will not wait for our internal matters to resolve themselves at our own convenience." Cale studied the assembled faces around the council table, understanding the legitimate weight behind Aldrich's concern, even as every instinct in him resisted the idea of formalizing a second marriage, while the question of Alira and the boy remained unresolved. "I hear your concern, Aldrich," he said finally, his voice steady despite the turmoil beneath it. "And I promise you, before this season ends, this matter of succession will be resolved, one way or another. But I ask for a short span of patience while certain inquiries are completed. There are questions I must answer for myself before I can properly answer them for this kingdom." The council accepted his words with visible reluctance, and as the session finally ended and the advisors filed slowly from the chamber, Cale remained seated alone at the long table, staring at the empty space where a portrait of his father had once hung, before being replaced, years earlier, with the Northland crest. He thought of the woman he had barely known for a single night, of the son the rumors suggested she might have raised alone for 6 long years without ever telling him the truth, and he understood, with a clarity that steadied something restless inside him, that whatever answers waited in Fenmore, he needed to find them himself, rather than trusting the matter entirely to trackers and second-hand reports. Within the week, against the careful advice of nearly every advisor at his court, Cale Draven began quietly preparing to travel south himself, telling only Corwin and a small handful of trusted guards the true purpose behind the journey, while the official explanation offered to the rest of the court spoke only of routine matters requiring the king's personal attention along the southern trade routes. He did not yet know what he would find in Fenmore, whether the rumors would lead him to genuine answers, or simply another false trail among the many he had already exhausted. But for the first time in years, he felt something close to purpose driving him forward, a determination to finally uncover the truth that had haunted the edges of his life since the single, half-remembered night that had started it all. The men who arrived in Fenmore claiming to be traders interested in the town's wool market seemed, at first glance, entirely ordinary. Their wagon loaded with reasonable goods, their manner polite and unremarkable, as they set up a modest stall near the edge of the market square. But Alira, who had spent 6 years training herself to notice exactly this kind of careful disguise, felt the old fear rise sharply the moment she caught sight of them from across the square, recognizing something in their bearing that immediately reminded her of the merchant guard's unsettling comment years earlier. She kept her distance from the newcomers over the following days, watching carefully from a cautious remove as they conducted their supposed business, noting how their eyes seemed to track far more than the ordinary flow of trade, lingering too long on certain homes, certain families, asking careful questions of the townspeople that seemed designed less to gather information about wool prices and more to gather information about the town's residents themselves. Mira, who had grown just as watchful as Alira over the years regarding any threat to Ronan's safety, came to her on the third evening of the trader's visit, with news that confirmed Alira's worst fears. "They have been asking about you," Mira said quietly, once they were safely alone within Alira's cottage. "Careful questions, disguised as idle curiosity, but questions about a widow who arrived in town some years back with a young son. I do not think they are traders, Alira. I think they came here specifically looking for you and Ronan." Alira felt the careful, quiet life she had built over 6 years threatened to collapse entirely around her in that single moment. The fear she had carried since the day of Ronan's birth finally arriving at her door, in a form far more concrete than she had ever allowed herself to fully imagine. She spent that night awake, turning over every possible response, weighing the danger of fleeing immediately against the risk of drawing even more attention through a hasty, obvious departure. In the end, it was not her own careful planning that determined how events would unfold, but a moment of simple, ordinary chance that neither she nor the watching trackers could have fully controlled. Ronan, now 6 years old and possessing an energy that had grown increasingly difficult to contain within the boundaries of careful caution, slipped away from the cottage garden the following afternoon, while Alira was occupied helping a neighbor with an injured animal, wandering toward the river where several local boys had gathered to test their skill at climbing the tall rocks along its edge. One of the boys, older and larger than Ronan, lost his footing partway up the rocks and began to fall, and in the single instant before the other children could even fully register what was happening, Ronan moved with a speed and precision that no 6-year-old child should have possessed, crossing the distance between them fast enough to catch the falling boy and break his fall, absorbing an impact that left Ronan himself unharmed, while the older boy escaped with nothing worse than a startled cry and a few minor bruises. It was, by every measure, an act of genuine heroism, and the other children who witnessed it immediately began recounting the story with wide-eyed excitement as they returned to town, praising Ronan's quick thinking and surprising strength to any adult willing to listen. Word of the incident spread through Fenmore within hours, exactly the kind of small-town gossip that Alira had spent 6 careful years trying to avoid. And by evening, the story had reached the ears of the very traders whose careful, watchful questions had already put Alira on edge. She learned of the incident from Greta, who relayed it with obvious pride in Ronan's bravery, entirely unaware of the danger such attention might now bring to the boy she had watched grow up in her own garden. Alira listened to the story with a mounting dread that made her hands tremble slightly as she thanked Greta for the news, already understanding, with sickening clarity, exactly what consequences this single unavoidable moment of childhood instinct might now bring crashing down around them both. The following morning, one of the traders approached Alira directly in the market square, his manner still carefully polite, still maintaining the fiction of ordinary trade business, but his eyes carried a sharpness now that made the pretense feel thin and unconvincing. "Your son," he said, "is quite remarkable. Strength like that, at such a young age, is rare indeed." Alira kept her expression carefully neutral, though every instinct in her screamed to gather Ronan immediately and flee the town entirely. "He is a strong child," she said simply, "as many children are." The trader's smile did not reach his eyes. "Of course," he said, "though I have traveled through many territories, and I have rarely seen such strength in a boy so young, outside the royal bloodlines of the North." The words hung between them with unmistakable meaning, and Alira understood, in that single exchange, that whatever careful disguise the man had maintained was now entirely unnecessary. that he had confirmed exactly what he had traveled south to discover, and that further denial on her part would accomplish nothing beyond delaying the inevitable conversation that now needed to happen. She returned to the cottage that afternoon with her heart pounding, gathering Mira and Greta together in a hurried, urgent conversation that finally revealed to both women the truth she had kept carefully hidden for 6 long years, the full story of the wedding, the deception, the child who carried, whether he yet understood it or not, a genuine claim to the Northland throne. Mira absorbed the revelation with the same steady calm she had shown throughout the years of their friendship, though her eyes carried a new understanding as she looked toward the window, where Ronan could be seen playing in the garden, entirely unaware of the danger now gathering around him. Greta, older and more shaken by the sudden weight of the secret she had unknowingly harbored for years, needed a longer moment to absorb everything Alira had finally chosen to share. "What will you do?" Greta finally asked, once the initial shock had settled into something closer to practical concern. "I do not know yet," Alira admitted honestly. "But I do not think we can remain in Fenmore much longer. Whoever sent these men, whether it was Kale himself or advisors acting on rumors that reached the Northland court, they now know exactly where to find us. Running again might only delay the inevitable, but staying here, waiting for whatever comes next, feels like a risk I am not prepared to take with Ronan's safety." That night, as she packed a small bag with the same careful, practiced efficiency she had once used to prepare for her flight from her family's home so many years earlier, Alira found herself thinking, unexpectedly, of Kale himself, wondering whether the men who had come to Fenmore were acting on his direct orders, or whether he remained entirely unaware that his search, if indeed it was his search, had finally succeeded in finding what he was looking for. She wondered what kind of man he had become in the 6 years since she last saw him, whether the anger she assumed he must feel toward her family's deception had hardened into something dangerous, or whether some part of him might still carry the quiet, exhausted decency she had glimpsed so briefly on their single night together. She did not have long to wonder before receiving her answer. 2 days after the trader's pointed comment in the market square, as Alira prepared to slip away from Fenmore under cover of early morning darkness, just as she had done twice before in her life, a small group of riders arrived at the edge of town, their approach quiet and deliberate, their bearing unmistakably that of trained warriors rather than ordinary travelers. And at the head of that small group, unmistakable even after 6 years, sat a man Alira recognized instantly, despite the passage of time, his dark hair longer now, his face carrying new lines of exhaustion and command, but his presence still carrying that same unmistakable weight she remembered from a candlelit hall so many years before. Kale Draven had come to Fenmore himself, and as Alira watched him dismount at the edge of the market square, his sharp eyes already scanning the small town with a purpose that left no room for doubt about why he had traveled so far from his own kingdom, she understood, with a certainty that steadied even as it terrified her, that the careful, hidden life she had built for Ronan over 6 long years was about to end, one way or another, before this single day was finished. Alira's first instinct, sharp and immediate, was to run, to gather Ronan and disappear into the countryside surrounding Fenmore before Kale's riders could reach her cottage. But even as the impulse rose in her, she recognized its futility. A woman on foot with a young child could not outrun trained warriors on horseback, and worse, any attempt at flight would only confirm every suspicion Kale had clearly already formed, transforming this moment from a difficult conversation into something closer to a hunt. She made herself stand still at the edge of the market square, her heart pounding so hard she feared it might be visible through her clothing, and watched as Kale's eyes moved across the small crowd that had gathered to observe the unexpected arrival of armed riders in their quiet town. When his gaze finally found her, something shifted immediately in his expression, a recognition that seemed to arrive not through memory of her face, which he had barely glimpsed 6 years earlier, but through some other, less definable instinct. He crossed the square toward her without hurry, his men remaining respectfully at a distance, and stopped close enough that Alira could see the careful control he was exercising over whatever emotion churned beneath his composed exterior. "Alira Voss," he said quietly, though it was not truly a question. She did not bother denying it. There seemed little point, given the certainty in his voice, the way his eyes had already found and studied every detail of her face, as though comparing it against 6 years of half-remembered fragments. "Kale," she said simply, and the sound of his true name spoken aloud after so many years of careful silence, felt strange and heavy on her tongue. "Where is my son?" Cale asked, and though his voice remained level, Elira could hear the effort it cost him to keep it so, the raw urgency straining just beneath the careful surface of the question. Elira felt something inside her steady, despite the fear still coursing through her, some deeper resolve rising to meet the moment she had feared for 6 long years. "He is safe," she said, "and before you take another step toward finding him, I think you owe me the chance to explain everything, from the very beginning, so that whatever you decide next, you decide with the full truth, rather than assumptions built on rumor and anger." Cale studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression softened slightly, enough that Elira recognized, with cautious relief, that the man standing before her had not become the vengeful, dangerous figure her worst fears had sometimes imagined over the years. "Speak then," he said. "But know that I have already learned much of the truth from Dessa, years ago. I know your family used you to save a wedding my bride could not stand for herself. What I do not yet understand is why you never came to me, why you chose to vanish and raise my son alone, rather than telling me the truth." They spoke for a long time that afternoon, seated finally at the small table within Greta's cottage while Mira kept careful watch over Ronan in the garden outside, and Elira told Cale everything, the desperate scramble of that first wedding night, her family's plan to quietly correct the deception. The moment she realized she carried a child who would complicate everything her family had hoped to manage so neatly, her fear of becoming nothing more than a political pawn in a game that had already shown her exactly how little her own wishes weighed against careful diplomatic calculation. "I did not run from you," Elira said, watching his face carefully as she spoke. "I ran from a family who had already proven they would decide my future, and my child's future, without ever asking what either of us actually wanted. I did not know, that first year, what kind of man you truly were, whether you would see Ronan as a son to be loved, or simply as a piece to be claimed for the sake of succession. I could not risk his safety on assumptions I had no way of confirming." Cale was quiet for a long moment after she finished, his jaw tight with an emotion Elira could not fully read, somewhere between old anger and a grief that seemed to run deeper than she had expected. "I spent years wondering about that night," he finally said, "wondering why the woman I remembered never quite matched the wife I eventually learned to live beside. I searched for you, Elira, more than once, though every trail eventually went cold. I want you to know that whatever anger I carried toward your family's deception, I never once intended harm toward you, if I had found you." "I did not know that," Elira admitted quietly. "I only knew what I feared, and I built my choices around protecting my son from every danger I could imagine, whether or not those dangers were real." It was at that moment that the cottage door opened, and Ronan stepped inside, drawn by curiosity despite Mira's efforts to keep him occupied in the garden, his eyes widening as he took in the unfamiliar man seated at their table, a man whose bearing and features carried an unmistakable resemblance to his own that even a child could not fail to notice. The room fell into a heavy, charged silence as Cale rose slowly from his seat, his eyes fixed on the boy standing in the doorway, with an expression of wonder that seemed to erase, for that single suspended moment, every year of anger and confusion that had brought him to this small cottage in a distant southern town. Ronan, for his part, studied the stranger with the same careful, watchful intensity Elira had noticed in him since infancy, some instinct in the boy recognizing, even before any words were spoken, that this moment carried a significance beyond his full understanding. Elira crossed the room and knelt beside her son, taking his hand gently in hers. "Ronan," she said carefully, "this is Cale. He is someone very important, and I think it is time you learned some things about where you come from." The conversation that followed stretched long into the evening, careful and gentle in ways Elira had not fully anticipated, Cale kneeling to speak with his son at eye level, asking simple questions about Ronan's life in Fenmore, his friends, the things that made him laugh, listening with a patience and genuine curiosity that eased, gradually, some of the fear that had gripped Elira since the moment she first recognized the riders approaching the town. It was Ronan himself, eventually, who asked the question that hung most heavily over the entire conversation, his young voice carrying a directness that momentarily silenced both adults in the room. "Are you my father?" he asked simply, looking between Elira and Cale with an openness that carried none of the complicated fear the grown adults around him had spent years carrying. Kale's composure finally broke, just slightly, at the simple honesty of the question, and when he answered, his voice carried a rough emotion he made no effort to hide. "Yes," he said, "I am your father, Ronan, and I am sorry it has taken me so long to find you." The days that followed brought careful, difficult conversations between Alira and Kale about what should happen next, conversations that stretched late into several evenings as they worked to find some path forward that honored both the safety Alira had worked so hard to build for Ronan and the responsibilities Kale now understood he could not simply set aside, given the boy's undeniable claim to the Northland throne and the mounting political pressure building against Kale's kingdom in his absence. Kale did not demand that Ronan be taken immediately north, did not threaten to separate the boy from the only mother and home he had ever known, a restraint that eased much of Alira's deepest fear, even as new, more complicated questions rose in its place. Instead, he proposed something Alira had not expected, a careful, gradual transition that would allow Ronan to slowly build a relationship with his father and his true heritage, without the sudden, wrenching upheaval of being torn entirely from everything familiar. "I do not want to force this," Kale told Alira during one of their long evening conversations, once Ronan had finally been settled into sleep. "I have spent years learning the cost of decisions made without full consideration for the people affected by them. I will not repeat that mistake with my own son. But I also cannot pretend the danger surrounding him does not exist, Alira. Bastion Thorn grows bolder every season, and if word of Ronan's existence reaches beyond the small circle who already knows the truth, he becomes a target the moment anyone understands what his claim to the throne might mean for the stability of my kingdom." Alira understood the truth of his warning, even as it frightened her, recognizing that the careful, hidden life she had built in Fenmore could no longer offer the protection it once had, now that both Kale's search and the market trader's careless words had already begun to spread word of Ronan's existence beyond the small circle of people Alira had trusted for so many years. Whatever came next, she understood, with a clarity that settled deep and unshakable, that the choice was no longer whether Ronan's true heritage would eventually become known, but how carefully that revelation could now be managed to keep him as safe as possible through whatever changes lay ahead. The journey north took 3 weeks, longer than Kale's original ride south had taken, slowed deliberately to allow Ronan time to adjust gradually to the enormous change unfolding in his young life. Alira rode beside her son for most of the journey, watching him absorb the shifting landscape with wide-eyed curiosity, the gentle hills of the southern territories slowly giving way to the sharper mountains and colder air of the Northlands, a transformation that mirrored, in its own way, the transformation unfolding within their entire family. Kale proved, throughout that long journey, to be far more patient and thoughtful than Alira had allowed herself to hope for during her years of careful hiding. He did not rush the process of building trust with his son, spending hours each evening simply talking with Ronan around the campfire, listening to stories about Fenmore, about Greta and Mira and the friends Ronan had left behind, sharing in return careful, age-appropriate stories about the Northlands, about the responsibilities that would eventually come with Ronan's heritage, though he was careful never to burden the boy with more weight than a child his age could reasonably carry. Alira found herself, during those quiet evenings, studying Kale in ways she had not allowed herself to during their brief, complicated first encounter 6 years earlier. She saw, more clearly now, the genuine decency beneath his composed exterior, the careful thoughtfulness he brought to every decision affecting Ronan's well-being, the honest grief that occasionally surfaced when he spoke of the years he had missed, unable to fully hide how deeply the loss of those early years had affected him, despite his best efforts at composure. "I am not asking you to forgive your family for what they did," Kale told her one evening, once Ronan had finally fallen asleep beside their fire. "But I want you to know that I understand now why you made the choices you did. I cannot say with certainty how I would have responded, 6 years ago, if you had come to me with the truth rather than fleeing. I would like to believe I would have protected you both, but I understand why you could not risk everything on that belief alone." Alira considered his words carefully before responding. "I have spent years wondering the same thing," she admitted. "Whether I made the right choice, or whether I simply let fear decide for me. I do not think there is a clean answer to that question. I only know that Ronan is safe, and that he has grown into a good, thoughtful boy despite everything. Whatever mistakes I made along the way, I do not regret protecting him as fiercely as I did." "Nor should you," Kale said quietly. Whatever comes next, for our family and for this kingdom, that fierce protection is something Ronan will carry with him for the rest of his life, and I believe it will serve him well, whatever path he eventually chooses to walk. Their arrival at the Northland Castle brought its own complicated set of challenges, the court immediately alive with whispers and speculation about the boy who had traveled north beside the king, his resemblance to Chaol unmistakable to anyone who studied him even briefly. Dessa met them at the castle gates, her expression carrying a complicated mixture of relief and apprehension as she studied her sister for the first time in 6 years. And the reunion between the two sisters, though brief and formal in the presence of watching courtiers, carried an unmistakable warmth that suggested the careful correspondence they had maintained over the years had preserved something essential between them, despite the distance and secrecy. "We have much to discuss," Dessa said quietly to Alira, once the initial formalities of arrival had passed and Ronan had been settled, wide-eyed and cautious, into rooms prepared for him within the castle. "But I am glad, more than I can properly say, that you are finally safe here, and that this secret no longer needs to divide our family the way it has for so long." The following weeks brought careful, difficult negotiations among Chaol, Dessa, and the senior advisors of the Northland court, working to determine how best to present Ronan's existence to the wider kingdom in a way that would strengthen, rather than destabilize, the fragile political situation Chaol had been managing for years. Aldrich, initially skeptical and cautious about the sudden appearance of an heir whose existence had been hidden for 6 years, gradually came to see the advantage the situation offered. A clear line of succession finally established, a direct answer to the pressure Bastian Thorn's ambitions had been placing on the kingdom's stability. Dessa herself proved instrumental in smoothing the transition, publicly acknowledging the complicated history of the wedding and its aftermath, with a grace and honesty that earned her considerable respect among the court, framing the situation not as scandal, but as a story of a family working through difficult circumstances to ultimately do right by a child and a kingdom both. Her willingness to set aside any personal difficulty in favor of the kingdom's stability, and Alira's, spoke to a generosity of spirit that Alira found herself deeply grateful for, understanding more clearly than ever the sacrifices her sister had quietly made throughout the entire complicated situation. Ronan himself adjusted to his new life with the same careful, watchful resilience Alira had always recognized in him, slowly building relationships with the court, with his father, with an uncle in Corwin who took genuine delight in teaching him the skills a future ruler would eventually need. He remained, through it all, unmistakably himself, carrying forward the thoughtful, quietly confident nature that had marked him since his earliest days in Fenmore, adapting to his new circumstances without losing the essential character his mother had worked so carefully to nurture through years of hidden, careful upbringing. Bastian Thorn's ambitions along the western border did not simply disappear with the announcement of a clear Northland heir, and the kingdom would continue facing challenges to its stability for years to come. But the immediate crisis that had threatened to fracture the Northlands during the uncertain years of Chaol and Dessa's childless marriage eased considerably once Ronan's existence became publicly known, the clear line of succession removing much of the vulnerability that ambitious neighbors had hoped to exploit. Alira, for her part, found herself settling gradually into a role within the Northland court that had never been formally defined by tradition, not quite queen, given the continued political marriage between Chaol and Dessa that both had agreed remained necessary for the kingdom's stability, but not quite outsider either, given her position as Ronan's mother and the growing respect she earned among the court for the strength and care with which she had raised her son alone through such difficult years. The relationship between Alira and Chaol remained, in those early months, careful and complicated, neither entirely resolved nor entirely broken, shaped by 6 years of separation and the complicated circumstances that had brought them back together. But in quiet moments, watching Ronan grow more confident and settled within his new home, Alira sometimes caught Chaol watching her with an expression that suggested the connection formed during that single, distant wedding night had never fully faded, even through years of uncertainty and distance. On the evening marking 1 full year since Ronan's arrival in the Northlands, Alira stood on a balcony, overlooking the same mountains she had once watched from Chaol's chamber window on her wedding night, so many years earlier, and found Chaol joining her there, the two of them standing quietly together, as the sun set gold and orange across the peaks in the distance. "We have both made difficult choices," Trying to protect the people we care about, Cale said finally, breaking the comfortable silence between them. I do not know what the future holds for either of us, given everything that has happened. But I know that Ronan is stronger and more thoughtful because of the years you gave him in Fenmore, and I am grateful, more than I can properly express, that you finally trusted me enough to let him find his way home. Illyra considered his words carefully, watching the last light fade slowly across the mountains, thinking of the long, uncertain journey that had brought her from a frightened bride standing at a stranger's altar to this quiet moment, standing beside the same man with a son who had grown, against every fear she had once carried, into exactly the kind of person she had always hoped he might become. He is home now, she said finally, and so, I think, am I. Below them, in the courtyard of the castle that would one day belong to their son, Ronan practiced sword forms under Corwin's patient instruction, his movements steady and confident despite his young age, carrying forward, into whatever future awaited the Northland throne, the fierce, careful love his mother had given him through every difficult year of hiding, and the steady, thoughtful strength his father was only now beginning to teach him in the open light of a kingdom finally ready to claim him as its own.